First of all, I'd like to thank the Frit Ord Foundation for inviting me here today. This is my first visit to Oslo, and I'm delighted to be here. I hope you're impressed by the special customized slide. I took a lot of trouble over that. I work at Cambridge, and at Cambridge we believe in going that extra mile. Okay, so I want to begin really. It's sort of been done in a way by the film we just saw, but I wanted to begin by just reminding you of some of the events of that day on the 28th of June 1914, the day that started it all. And I thought I'd start with this picture of a couple who are about to have what I think can truly be described as a very bad day. That's Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie Chotek. They arrive in here you can see them, they're actually at Sarajevo railway station. He can be seen waving to people. That's an image of the Balkans in 1911 and 1914. I've put that there simply to remind you of the location of Serbia, its close proximity, its cheek by jowl proximity with Bosnia-Herzegovina, the closeness of Sarajevo to the Serbian border, but also the amazing proximity of Belgrade to the border with Austria. It's a few minutes' drive from Belgrade to the Austrian border. It gives you a sense of the intimacy as well as the hostility between these two difficult neighbours, Austria-Hungary and Serbia. And this is an image of Sarajevo. This is about as close as the early 20th century got to Google Earth. It's an image from many will recognize it from the Baedeker travel guide, and basically I've included it because you can see the kind of city Sarajevo is. It's a city organized around a river. The river is the lowest point in the city, and on either side the sort of hills and rise up higher and higher and higher to 6,000 feet eventually. And it's along the side of that river, along the quay adjoining that river, that Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie proceeded into Sarajevo. Now the rest of the narrative is fairly clear. I just like this diagram because of its brutal simplicity. On the way in towards, moving eastwards across the city towards the city hall, a bomb was thrown by a young man called Nedeljko Čabrinović. The bomb missed. Instead it gouged a hole in the road under the car behind the Archduke and his wife. It injured some people, not very seriously, but it injured them, and that car was made to stop. At this point, various people who were accompanying the couple very sensibly made the suggestion that it might now be a good idea to call off the tour of Sarajevo. But Franz Ferdinand was not someone who liked to be given advice. He was very quick to anger. It was said of him that his ministers and attendants rarely waited on him without beating hearts. He was prone to terrifying bursts of anger. He didn't like security details. He didn't like being guarded and protected. He was very impatient, and he said, "Oh, the man's clearly a lunatic. Continue with the planned tour. Forget it. We'll just continue." And so the car continued into the heart of Sarajevo. They arrived that was premature. They arrived at the city hall, the Rathaus of Sarajevo, a rather remarkable 19th century sort of pseudo-Islamic Orientalist building. And it was there that he took his last look at the city from the balcony, looking out over the minarets, and this was a very Muslim city at the time. And a rather comical event took place at the city hall. He was welcomed by the mayor, a man called Čurčić, Mehmet Čurčić, who was actually himself a Bosnian Muslim, and wearing a fez. It was his task in ceremonial uniform to present a sort of speech of welcome. Now, Mehmet Čurčić was not someone who enjoyed public occasions. He was a very nervous and rather anxious man. And he'd also been informed, he'd heard the noise, the bang, and he'd been informed that there had been a bomb which had narrowly missed the couple as they were coming down the Apel Quay along the river Miljačka. And so he was even more nervous than he would otherwise have been, but he was so nervous that he couldn't change his text. But unfortunately his text had now become totally inappropriate to the occasion, because it began with the words, "It is with sentiments of the deepest joy that the citizens of Sarajevo welcome your highnesses." And the response of Franz Ferdinand, as you can imagine, was a splenetic outburst of rage. He said, "You call this welcome? You throw bombs at your visitors? Is that what you call welcome?" And at this point, his wife leaned over towards him and whispered something, the exact content of which is lost to history, but we can assume it was something along the lines of, "Calm down, dear, it's not his fault." At which point he did calm down, and Mehmet Čurčić continued with his unhappy speech, and then they went to the front of the city hall, and at this point it was resolved that the cars should leave, and it was proposed that they should drive straight back down the Appel Quay instead of turning right up there into Franz Josef Street, which would take the cars into the Bazaar district with narrow roads from which it would be easy to mount another attack. And as they discussed the danger of a further attack, someone turned to Potjorek, the Landeschef, the man who was responsible for all the non-existent security precautions that should have been made on that day, and asked him, "Do you think there's danger of a further assault on His Highness?" To which Potjorek replied, "What? Do you think Sarajevo is full of assassins?" That was a rhetorical question. But of course, the answer was yes. It was indeed full of assassins on that day. 7, to be exact. 7 young men who had come to very young men who had come to this place to carry out this mission. And there we see an extremely fanciful French rendition from the Petit Journal, a wonderful source of contemporary illustrations, most of them completely fallacious and imagined. This one makes it look like an operatic scene. It looks as if he's singing, "I die!" In fact, he did nothing of the kind. The two of them didn't stand up. He made them stand up so we could see them and see her and him together in all their glory. But in fact, they remained completely immobile. In fact, it was unclear, even to Count Harrach, who was standing on the running board of the car, the Archduke's bodyguard, it was unclear to him that they'd been injured. At first he thought that they'd been missed and that they were simply in shock. But it was only when the car reversed and started speeding down the Appel Quay and blood began to issue from the Archduke's mouth that he realized that something was amiss, and she then teetered sideways and wound up with her head on his lap. And it was then that he uttered these words, which became famous all around the world. Within the next 24 hours, there was a huge media. These words went viral, is what you'd call it today. They became viral, and the words were "Sophal, Sophal, sterbe nicht, lebe für unsere Kinder." Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children. And they drove back to the Connacht. By the time they reached the Connacht, he was deeply comatose, and she was already dead. And the rest, as you know, you know about already. Who had done this? Well, it was odd to hear Kenneth Branagh in that package we heard before, the video package, saying that the Austrians claimed they were Serb nationalists. I think even they called themselves Serb nationalists. They weren't all Serbs. One of them was a Bosnian Muslim, but the rest of them were indeed ethnically Serbian subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And they certainly identified themselves with the case of a pan-Serbian national cause, and they were quite explicit about this in front of the Austrian court, and quite proud to call themselves fighters for Serb nationhood, though they also associated the cause of a pan-Serbian, a greater Serbian state, with the foundation of a South Slav state, about the internal arrangements of which they were rather unclear. But in any case, they hailed from a movement known as the Black Hand. They were loosely linked with the Black Hand, also with local irredentist movements within Bosnia, but also connected with the Black Hand, a sort of ultra-nationalist movement based in Belgrade. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And there are members of the rest of the commando and so on. Okay, so that's the events of the 28th of June. And as we know, and this is not, I'm telling you something you all know already, on the morning of that day, when they arrived at the railway station, Europe was at peace. And indeed, if you'd asked the statespeople, well, in fact, they were statesmen, they were all men, a very important fact in its own right, as I know Ute Frevert knows, they were all men, and it's something which we should be thinking about, how their masculinity plays into the way they behaved over the following 4 to 6 weeks. But if you'd asked any of the statesmen of that on that morning, the best informed, if you'd asked them how likely is a major continental war, then virtually all of them would have told you that the war had in the last few months and years become less likely rather than more likely. And I think always of the remarkable comment made by Arthur Nicholson at the end of May 1914, who looked out of the windows of the Foreign Office in London and said, "In all the time that I have been working for the British Foreign Office, I have never seen such calm international waters." And yet, of course, 37 days later, Europe was at war, and the war that unfolded from that continental war, the World War of 1914 to 18, has justifiably, it's a truism now, it's a cliche, but it's a true cliche, a true truism, has justly been called the Urkatastrophe, the original catastrophe of the 20th century world, the catastrophe that disfigured the 20th century before it was 20 years old. It destroyed or consumed 3 empires, the German Empire, well, the 4 if you count the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and it accounted more importantly, I think, did I mention? No, the Austro-Hungarian, of course, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Russian, and what's the other one that I've missed? Which one was the other one? Ottoman, exactly. That makes 4, doesn't it? I'm not very good at counting things up, exactly. Statistics was never my strong point. Yeah, so it consumed 4 major multi-ethnic empires. It consumed more seriously the lives of 10 million young men, 10 million military deaths at least. The global estimates are still not very good. It accounted for between 15 and 21 million wounded, seriously wounded. The light wounds that were treated in theatre have never been counted, so we don't have any total for those, but we have, and not all of those light wounds were what we would think of as light wounds, but certainly serious wounds, at least 15 million. It was, as Fritz Stern rightly said, it was the disaster from which all the other disasters of the 20th century sprang. It's very difficult to imagine the rise of fascism in Italy without this war. It's difficult to imagine, or virtually impossible to imagine, the October Revolution in Russia. It's very easy to imagine a February Revolution. Everybody had predicted that, but very difficult to imagine the Bolshevik seizure of power, the creation of a one-party state, the Russian Civil War, which in its turn consumed further millions of lives, and of course, also very difficult to imagine the rise of National Socialism, of Nazism in Germany, and thereby also of the Holocaust. And my former colleague at Cambridge, now a historian at Yale, Adam Tooze, is currently working on a book which will come out, I think, next year, whose central thesis is that the First World War brought about the complete unhinging of the international system with extremely toxic and long-lasting consequences, some of which are still being felt today. And so it follows from all of this that the question of how this war came about possesses an intrinsic interest. Now, I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm not the first person to have noticed that. The debate over how this war came about is an old debate. In fact, it's older than the war itself, because the arguments and recriminations about who was bringing this war about actually began before the first shots were fired. And in fact, it's very striking how many of the lines of argument that you find in the secondary literature, you can also find on the lips of those who actually brought this war into the world. It's astonishing how many of the, including the primacy of internal politics, the role of imperialism, it's all there in the idea that public opinion forced people to take action and so on. It's all there in the sort of vox populi of the participants in the crisis. And in 1991, when he did a sort of count of the literature, the American historian John Langdon, in a book called The Long Debate, whose title is also, in a sense, the book's thesis, came up with 25,000 titles of books and articles in English alone on this subject. And of course, there have been a great many since. And so it becomes more understandable why Rebecca West, who wrote this wonderful travel log, Black Lamb, Grey Falcon, one of the deepest reflections, I think, on the place of the Balkans in the history of the 20th century, a really remarkable book. When Rebecca West went to Sarajevo in 1937 and climbed the stairs to the balcony where Franz Ferdinand had stood and looked at this city before he left for his appointment with the assassins on Franz Josef Street, she turned to her husband, or more precisely to one of her husbands, and she said, "I shall never understand how it all happened. It is not that we know too little, it is that we know too much." And we know, of course, a great deal more now than we do then. And so the question arises, why keep working away at this problem? Why add another book? In my particular case, why bother adding another book? And certainly I was approached by many colleagues while I was working on this book, anyone, in fact, to whom I said I was working on a book on the outbreak of the First World War, and the answer was usually, "Oh, why on earth are you doing that? Surely this subject has been worked to death." And that's a wonderful thing about one's colleagues. Just as you're struggling with the complexities of a really difficult project, they come up with excellent reasons why you should give up and die. Of course, one has to find an answer to this question, and the answer is, the debate is old, to be sure, but although the debate is old, the subject is still fresh. In fact, in some respects, it's fresher today than it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago. Because when I first encountered this subject as a schoolboy in Sydney, Australia, a great deal of period charm had gathered around the drama of 1914. It had become a kind of period drama, an Edwardian costume piece. And the book one read in those days was the thrilling narrative history of Barbara Tuchman. It's still a wonderful book. It was very widely read. It was a bestseller, so it sold hundreds of thousands of copies in many different languages. But the interesting thing about Tuchman's book is that it dwells very lovingly on all sorts of details, the details of uniforms, splendid menus from gala dinners, Lord Salisbury riding to the House of Commons on a tricycle, pushed by his butler or his valet James through St James Park. Push James, push, with his coattails fluttering behind him. In other words, the ornamentalism, as David Cannadine has called it, the ornamentalism of a bygone world, a world of yesterday, and the assumption stealthily established itself that if these people had gaudy green ostrich feathers, and we saw some of those feathers in that package just before, the video footage, if people's hats and helmets had gaudy green ostrich feathers on them, then perhaps their ideas and dreams had ostrich feathers as well. In other words, that these were people who no longer could speak to us, whose worlds were no longer intelligible to us. And yet, if you fast forward to the early 20th century and view the calamity from our present-day standpoint, you can't help but be struck by the raw modernity of the events of 1914. The fact, for example, that it begins with a cavalcade of automobiles. I mean, there's not a horse in sight. This is about a long line of cars. And in fact, if you run through your mind the events of on the Appel Quay on the 28th of June 1914, you can't help but think of Dallas in November 1963. The anniversary of that event, of course, was just yesterday, as you know, the 50th anniversary. It began with a squad of suicide bombers in a very literal sense. These were young men who had been instructed, after they carried out their mission, to take their own lives. They were carrying not just bombs and pistols, but also paper twists full of potassium cyanide. And if the potassium cyanide had been chemically effective, the two most important participants in the assassination, Chabrinovich and his accomplice Princip, would not have survived that day. Unfortunately, it was inferior quality, and they did survive, albeit in great pain, vomiting and retching and so on, as they were carted off to the police station. And of course, these young men were loosely linked with an underground network, a network that cultivated a culture of a sort of cult of death, sacrifice, and revenge. I want to burn like a torch for my people. One of the Serbian the would-be Serbian assassin Jarajic had stated before the Austrian had stated rather in his own diary before he took his own life. He was another suicide assassin, killed himself in 1910. And on the night before they carried out their assassinations, Princip and Chabrinovich and several of their friends went to Jarajic's grave and laid flowers on the grave, though the Austrian Gerichtsprotokoll, the Austrian court protocols, rather nastily observed that these flowers were not bought specially to be presented at the grave of Jarajic, but stolen from other neighbouring graves. That's the kind of detail only the Austrians would come up with, but that's why we like them so much. Anyway, and our compass on these events, our perspective has shifted in other ways as well. It's become, I think, less obvious since the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s that we should simply airbrush the Balkans from the scene and sideline them in the way that they've been marginalized in much of the literature on the outbreak of war. The event of 9/11, the assault on the Twin Towers in New York, I think reminded us of the power of an event, of a terrorist event. Even if we see in this event, even if we want to embed it, and rightly so as historians, in longer-term processes, nevertheless, the power of an event is something that hasn't always been obvious to the writers of history. Events fell out of fashion, if you like, in the 60s and 70s, and gradually sort of resumed their dignity in the 80s and 90s. But 9/11 brought home the power of an event of this kind, a symbolic event, to transform the chemistry of politics. And finally, there's the fact that we're in an era which in some ways is closer to 1914 than the period of bipolar stability of the Cold War. We're just in fact coming to terms with what it means that we're out of that world, disciplined by the encounter between two nuclear hyperpowers, and instead in a world marked by the sort of the interaction of rising powers, of weary giants, weary titans, to use David Reynolds' term for Great Britain in 1914, or around the turn to the 20th century. We now have another weary titan in the United States, uncertain of its place in the world, wondering how long its current hegemony, its current full spectrum dominance can last. We have rising powers that are challenging the world order in various ways. And so in some ways we're in a world which is becoming more like 1914. In a curious way, as 1914 pulls away into the past, it also grows closer to us. And these shifts in perspective prompt us, I think, to rethink the story of how war came to Europe. Accepting this challenge does not mean, and I really want to emphasize this, it does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism that remakes the past in order to meet the needs, aesthetic or fashionable or political, of the present, but rather it means acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point affords us a clearer view. It's always seemed to me that the past is in some ways like a vast and complex edifice, and when our perspective changes, we can see parts of the edifice that we couldn't before from our previous vantage point. Bearing all this in mind, how does one then go about refreshing the narrative? How do you, make it new? And what I try to do is it falls essentially, I think, under four rubrics. And I want to say just a few very brief words because I'm aware that we've started off slightly late and I don't want to cut into question time, so I'm going to make it as short as possible. But one way one can sort of refresh the picture is by not to start off by trying to change the answer, but to start off by changing the question. In other words, instead of asking why did this war come about, which has been the question at the heart of a great deal of the origins literature, you can try asking how Europe went to war in 1914. How did this war come about? Now, questions of how and why are, of course, logically, ultimately inseparable. You can't fully disentangle them. But they lead us, nonetheless, in different directions. The question why leads us along a road which is going to end in rather remote, categorical, abstract causes. The question why, if we ask the question why, we'll wind up thinking in categories: imperialism, nationalism, arms races, and so on. And what happens when you start listing causes like that? You get a lot of analytical clarity, which is good. I mean, analytical clarity is always good. But at the same time, you get a sort of optical distortion, a distortion of the field of vision. As you pile up the causes, you squeeze out contingency, you squeeze out agency, until in the end, the people whose decisions brought this war about become the mere executors of abstract, impersonal historical forces. Their choices, their decisions are pushed out, crowded out of the field of vision, and the war moves from being possible to probable to inevitable. And yet some of the most interesting recent work on the outbreak of the First World War has been pushing exactly the opposite case. I'm thinking here of Holger Afflerbach and David Stevenson's joint volume, The Improbable War, which precisely argues that in some ways war was getting less likely in 1913 to 14. I won't go into the details, but there are all sorts of reasons why contemporaries had a right, or intelligent and informed contemporaries had a right to think that war, the danger of a major continental conflict, was receding to the horizons rather than steadily growing in the way that's implied by that piling up of causes that you get when you ask the why question. There's another question, another issue with the why question, and that was raised by a Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars and the First World War, who made the rather shrewd remark. He commented, "When we ask the question why, guilt soon becomes the focal point." In other words, when we ask why, what we often mean is who. Who did this? And an approach based on blame, if we focus the whole question on trying to find the guilty party, then this obliges us to draw up a charge sheet, either to draw up a charge sheet against a particular party or to find arguments to exonerate parties. And both of those things have been very central features of the literature on the outbreak of the First World War. In many cases, you find what's happening is a suspect is identified and a charge sheet is then prepared. The archives are ransacked for every bit of proof that you can find of the guilt and malice and aforethought of the guilty party. And of course, the most famous and memorable example of that approach, that blame-based approach, are the various books, redactions of a German war guilt thesis by Fritz Fischer, elaborated by various colleagues of his, which centered on the notion that this war was brought about by one state. Above all, of course, Germany is not the only state that's been blamed. I mean, more recently we've had Sean McMeekin's book squarely laying blame for the outbreak of war on Russia, and we even have the quirky interventions of Neil Ferguson, who's blamed Britain. I mean, always good for a laugh, and so on. In any case, is this being televised? No, good, okay. Sorry, Neil. Anyway, okay, so By contrast, asking the question how leads you down different paths. I mean, it leads you down, firstly, down paths rather than down a road. You no longer have this Königsweg of guilt. Instead, what you have is a whole sequence of paths interacting with each other in quite unstable and often unpredictable ways. What happens when you ask how is that you have to identify the decisions that brought this war about. And this does not mean excluding the question of responsibility from the picture. Not at all. In the end, you do have to address it. There's no question. If only because of the importance that it held for the generation that fought that war and for subsequent generations since. But rather it means allowing the questions about why to grow out of the answers to the questions about how, rather than the other way around. So ask how first, and then start to think about responsibility, rather than deciding you have an a priori case against a particular state, and then show how that particular state brought war about. So to do it the first way, rather than the second. Okay, so that was the first way in which I think it might be possible, thought it might be possible to sort of refresh the picture. There are other things. There's the rather banal matter, this is the second rubric, simply of drawing together the most interesting themes in the existing literature. I mean, this is the most sophisticated, it's probably also the largest historiographical debate in the history of history. I mean, there is nothing else like it. It's unmatched for sophistication and moral intensity. It's quite an extraordinary literature in its own right, and I'm sure there are a lot more studies and books and PhDs in the history of that debate than have yet been written. But what one can do, what is quite clear about one of the most interesting features about this debate is that we're far from reaching a consensus. And the picture of how this war came about is really in flux, and there have been lots of very interesting recent initiatives. I'm thinking of Thomas Otti's efforts to globalize the field of vision, to connect China, for example, with the outbreak of the First World War by showing the increasing salience of the China question in the background to this war. Or William Mulligan's big book is just about to appear with Yale, which again is very focused on a globally framed system of transnational or international relations. There's also a lot of recent writing which has been much less inclined to place Germany at the center of the story of how Europe is polarizing in the period up to 1914, and has paid much more attention to the ongoing tensions right up until the outbreak of war between Britain and Russia. For example, one very interesting and often overlooked fact from the summer of 1914 is that just as this war as the crisis was about to break out in Sarajevo, in Whitehall in London, they were thinking about dropping the Anglo-Russian Convention. They were tired of dealing with the Russians because the Russians had broken with the spirit and the letter of the convention in many respects in Central Asia, Tibet, China, everywhere. And they were thinking of dropping the Russians and instead seeking some kind of understanding with Berlin. And in fact, the private secretary to Sir Edward Grey, the then foreign secretary, had been briefed for a mission to Berlin, which, of course, then was never undertaken because the war overtook events. But the point is that this wasn't a war in which everybody was looking with fear and trembling at Berlin. This was a war in which all the players had more than one enemy. It was a complex world with multiple empires, all with rivalrous and difficult relationships with each other. It was not a world unified by hostility to the Central Powers until, of course, the war broke out in 1914. So that's another point, to sort of capture trends. Another point, another way of freshening the story, I thought, might be to develop a new pattern of scrutiny, to shift the balance of emphasis a little, which is in a way what most historical revision is about. It's you can't. It's not a point. It's not a question of revising or denying what's already known, or of claiming that Fisher was wrong, because Fisher wasn't wrong. I mean, he didn't make up his sources. It was all there in the archives where he found it. But rather of shifting the balance of emphasis, of reorganizing, reconstellating the picture. And you can do this in various ways. One aspect of the pre-war that I found very interesting was not to think of the executive decision-making centers in London, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Rome, Vienna, and so on, not as unitary, monolithic structures capable of generating a policy driven by a coherent and unified will. That's how cartoonists pictured international relations. They still do today. But in Punch and so on, you have all these cartoons where Britain is represented by Queen Victoria or by King George, and the Germany is always the Kaiser with bristling, trembling, erect moustaches, and Japan is a sort of Japanese is a sort of stock racist image of a Japanese, and Russia is the Tsar, and so on. The idea being that the fiction establishing itself being that these states were like people, that they could form a single intention. But actually, when you look at how foreign policy was made in a place like St. Petersburg, then what you find is there is no unified will. It's a chorus of voices which are all in competition with each other, all disagreeing with each other, an incredibly chaotic picture. So if you would ask a very well-informed Russian in January 1904, who actually makes foreign policy in St. Petersburg, he would have said, well, undoubtedly the Tsar, the autocrat, truly is an autocrat. He really is the one who makes the decisions. Right now he's very focused on Japan. Now, fast forward a year or two, and you've had the absolute disaster of the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Tsar plays a very important role, bringing that war about. And if you ask the same question again of your imagined Russian, then the answer he would give would be, well, no, we don't really hear very much of the Tsar anymore. He's sort of disappeared from the scene. It's the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Stolypin. We heard from Stolypin in the video we heard before. He's the one who's running the show. But if you ask the same question again in 1908-9, then the answer would be, no, it's the foreign minister. He's teamed up with the Tsar behind the back of Stolypin and all the other ministers, and so on. So in other words, the power to make policy was constantly shifting from one node in the system to another. And if that was true of Russia, I mean, in some cases, one even finds oneself wondering whether it's appropriate to speak of Russian foreign policy, of a foreign policy, which is Russian, or even a Balkan policy, which is Russian, when you have to deal with so many competing policy formulations, and there's almost an element of randomness in the question of which of these formulations prevails over the other. And it's even more, the picture in France is even more chaotic. I mean, think of the fact that during Edward Grey's tenure in office, he was in office for 16 years, sorry, not for 16 years, I've forgotten exactly, it's 11 years, and during the years that Grey was in office, 16 French foreign ministers came and went. Now, and 2 of them came and went twice, which is really something. They were foreign ministers, and they went out again. A few years later, they reappeared, then they went out again. Quite a few of these foreign ministers had no idea of foreign policy. They'd just been shunted in there by their party machines. The foreign ministry was not a very highly respected position. The people who really made policy in France were not the foreign ministers, but the permanent functionaries in the Centrale, as it was called, in the Quai d'Orsay. But even they were a factionalized group, divided into subcultures. And the ambassadors had no intention of allowing themselves to become mere carriers out, mere executors of the policies in Paris. On the contrary, Paul Cambon, the French ambassador to London, famously remarked that the task of the ambassador is always to receive instructions from Paris, to place them in the fireplace and burn them. Of course, nowadays ambassadors are not allowed or not supposed to do that, but in those days it was a different picture. In any case, you can't burn instructions anymore because the smoke detectors won't allow you to. Okay, so it was, in other words, to get away from this idea that international relations is like a bunch of billiard balls rolling around on a green baize table, and to realize that these are very opaque and very unpredictable organisms, and that their opacity, their unpredictability, increased the crisis proneness of this system in all kinds of ways. And there are many of the pre-war crises one can put down to precisely this sort of factional instability within the individual policy-making apparatuses. In my view, that's how to explain the Bosnian annexation crisis, for example, which begins with a sort of lone wolf initiative from the Russian foreign minister, not covered, not authorized by his prime minister, Stolypin. Or, for that matter, the Agadir crisis of 1911, again, where it's a particular sort of rogue group within the Quai d'Orsay which starts things going. And it's not always the French and the Russians, the Germans do the same. The German foreign ministry, foreign policy-making apparatus is just as fractured and unstable as the others. Finally, one can highlight aspects of the narrative which have been, might have been overlooked in previous accounts. The one that I thought was particularly important was the Italian assault on Libya in 1911. Well, I happened to be writing about that in 2011, and I had a sort of out-of-body experience when I opened the papers, and there was this big headline, airstrikes on Libya, strikes on Tripolis, Benghazi, and there are all these names which were cropping up exactly in what I was writing. And it was even odder than that, because 1911 happened to have been the very first war in which aerial bombardments took place. This is the first time that aeroplanes were used in reconnaissance, and the first time that bombs were thrown from aeroplanes, when I say thrown, they were actually thrown by hand, by the pilot. He could only take 2 or 3, and they had to be primed. He would clutch them between his knees. They would be primed like that, and then thrown by hand while he tried to control the machine. I mean, it was a fairly adventurous business. But on the other hand, there were racks of up to 250 of these bombs in the dirigibles, in the airships deployed by the Italian army at this time, and they rained terror down on the Arabo-Turkish troops, as they were called at the time, in 1911. So there are all kinds of, and the point about this attack on Libya is that is the assault which flashed a green light for a sort of, a helter-skelter assault on the Ottoman Europe across the Balkans. The former head of the political department of the Serbian Foreign Ministry, a very interesting and intelligent observer of politics called Miroslav Spalajkovic, a man who really knew what he was talking about, remarked to a French journalist in 1920, he said, the Italian assault on Libya, he said, ça c'était la première agression. That was the first aggression from which the other subsequent aggressions unfolded. And he was someone who understood the place of the Balkan Wars in the larger framework of international relations better than virtually anybody else. Okay, so I want to come to a close and simply say that, and this is the sort of upshot of my argument for approaching this from a how perspective rather than a why one, is that once you ask the question how, instead of orienting yourself towards the question why, or even more so to the question who, once you do that, it's very hard, once you walk those paths, to return to the certainties of the Fisher thesis and of all the work which came out of the Fisher thesis, in which the Germans played this role as the only state which actually willed or wanted war. Now, there's no doubt about the appeal of what's sometimes called the blame game. I remember I was doing this book, actually, I was working in the French archives, and who should I find in the French archives but my wonderful colleague Isabelle Hull from Cornell, who's a fantastic historian, absolutely brilliant historian. We got chatting about this, and she said, what are you working on? I told her, and after the usual expressions of skepticism, she said, so what are you planning to do? And I said, well, I suppose I kind of want to get away from the blame game. And she said, oh, really? I think the blame game is the best game in town. The problem with the blame game, in my view, is that it is not, this is the key point, that the problem is not that you might end up blaming the wrong party, because frankly it doesn't matter who we blame for the outbreak. It used to matter hugely. I mean, people lived and died by these questions, but today it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter who you blame. The problem with the blame game is rather a different one. It's almost an epistemological problem, namely that if you orient yourself towards the question of blame, you wind up having to assume that in all conflicts, in all interest conflicts, one party must be right and one party must be wrong. But if you, for example, ask yourself the question, if you pose the question, was it wrong for the Serbs to want to establish a pan-Serbian state? After all, they were not trying to do anything that the Italians hadn't done in 1859, or that the Germans hadn't done in 1866 and 1871. Was it wrong of them to seek to create a larger Serbian state in which all Serbs would be at home, ruled by, as it were, from the Serbian capital Belgrade? And was it wrong, on the other hand, for the Austrians to oppose this objective by insisting on the independence of the Albanian state, which after all did contain a very large Albanian population? The borders of Albania, nearly a half of Albanians were not inside those borders, and Albania was a very, very substantially majoritarian Albanian area. So was it wrong for the Austrians to support Albania? Was it wrong for the Serbs to strive for pan-Serbia? Obviously, these were two objectives that could not be pursued in tandem. They were on a direct collision course. Now, of course, the answer is that the question is ridiculous. It makes no sense to ask which of these objectives was more wrong than the other. What matters is that these objectives were bound to lead to conflict if they were both pursued à l'outrance. So in other words, turning all of these questions into moral questions about a bad cause versus a good cause is not always the best way to understand how they contributed to the outbreak of conflict. In other words, I suppose what I'm arguing is that this is not, in the end, a James Bond narrative. It's not a story in which velvet-jacketed villains with prosthetic hands stroking cats adjust levers on complex machines and cause the war to plunge into Armageddon. It's not an Agatha Christie murder mystery in which at the end of the narrative we discover the pastor crouched with a blood-stained swordfish over the corpse of Lady Carrington in the conservatory. It's not that kind of narrative. The crisis of 1914 and all the pre-war crises were intensely interactive, multi-agent crises. They were complex. In fact, I think one can argue that the crisis that brought this war about was the most complex crisis of modern times, possibly the most complex crisis of any time. It was not a fruit of the system as such, of a sort of bloodless machinery. It was the consequence of the decisions taken by a gallery of actors, each of which held a very large share of power, a gallery of actors who shared a fundamentally similar European political culture. And it was to illuminate those aspects of the crisis of 1914 that I wrote this book. Thank you very much.